Nelson Mandela's release from prison was a major event. The stakes were high, and the people who worked so hard behind the scenes to make that happen knew that. The reunion is next.
BBC Radio 4's The Complete Smiley.
What's that? Someone's in the house. Hello?
Good evening, gentlemen.
Simon Russell Beale returns as George Smiley in John le Carré's The Looking Glass War. Coming soon to BBC Radio 4.
Now, a special edition of The Reunion, recorded in Cape Town, and an historic gathering as Sue McGregor brings together some of the leading negotiators who helped to secure the release of Nelson Mandela and the end of apartheid in South Africa.
Almost 20 years ago, Nelson Mandela walked free from the gates of his prison near Paarl in the Western Cape Winelands, where I'm standing next to Mandela's statue. With me are some young admirers who are having their photographs taken against the statue, his fist raised into a late winter sky. Much of the outside world had expected the apartheid regime in South Africa to end in a bloodbath. But by the mid-1980s, in a series of extraordinary top-secret meetings, the enemies who'd publicly declared they'd not negotiate, the African National Congress and the White Afrikaner Nationalist Government, began talking to each other. The ANC had taken up the armed struggle against the white government in 1961. In 1964, Mandela, after his arrest and trial, was sentenced to life imprisonment for attempting to overthrow the state. 20 years later, many of Mandela's ANC colleagues had joined him in jail. The ANC leadership, impatient for change, then issued a dramatic message: render South Africa ungovernable. By 1985, South Africa was facing increasingly violent demonstrations of defiance from its majority black community, which intensified the pressure for Mandela's release. President Botha made an offer.
I am prepared to release Mr. Mandela if he would say that he rejects violence as a means to reach and to achieve political ends.
My father says, I cannot and will not.
Mandela drafted his reply, and at a huge public rally, his daughter Zinzi Mandela read out her father's statement.
Your freedom and mine cannot be separated. I will return. Amanda!
Mandela's decision to remain in jail threw the ball back at the president. He called on his Minister of Justice, Kobie Coetzee.
And he said to me, you know, we have painted ourselves into a corner. Can you get us out?
Nelson Mandela, the guerrilla leader, has been seen outside prison.
At the end of 1985, Mandela, after more than 2 decades in prison, was taken to hospital in Cape Town for a minor operation. Justice Minister Coetzee decided to visit him.
We started to talk about how to normalise things, how to normalise politics in South Africa. I decided to trust him. And later on I got the impression he also made up his mind to trust me.
He hinted at the possibility of the ANC and the government sitting down to sort out the problems of the country. But it was done very discreetly.
Discretion was Mandela's main concern.
He informed me of what
George Bezos was Mandela's lawyer.
His message to Coetzee was, don't regard me as part of the problem. Regard me as part of the solution.
But the press got wind of the meeting and challenged Bezos.
We know nothing about that.
Can you deny that it's taken?
We know nothing about that, sir.
With me here in Cape Town to remember the secret talks which led to the unbanning of the ANC and to the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990 are some of the core negotiators and key campaigners of the time. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, activist Archbishop of Cape Town. Dr. Neil Barnard, who was head of the country's National Intelligence Service and who had dozens of clandestine meetings with Mandela. Professor Willie Esterhuizer, an Afrikaner academic who liaised between the government and the ANC. Aziz Bahad, who was a core member of the ANC and was the leader of many of its delegations, and the journalist and political commentator Alistair Sparks, who chronicled the negotiations in a revealing book. And also joining us on the line from Johannesburg, former President Thabo Mbeki, in the 1980s a crucial negotiator for the ANC. Let me start with you, Aziz Bahad, if I may. Looking back to those years in the mid-1980s, before talks began, how likely did it seem that some accommodation would be reached? How likely did it seem that people would start talking to each other?
Well, the discussion of possible talks were heatedly taking place in our ranks, but the situation in the region at that time had fundamentally changed. And what was clear to many of us was that you had to move towards finding a political solution, otherwise the country would be destroyed in totality.
Neil Barnard, if you can think back to your job in those old days before the talks began, if anyone had told you that they were going to take place and you were going to be one of the most important negotiators, would you have believed them?
The crucial point is that the NIS,
National Intelligence Service.
National Intelligence Service for that matter, we from the very early 80s believed that there's only one way to find a solution to our country's future, and that was to find a political settlement. And the only way to find a political settlement is to talk to the right people on the other side. And who was the right man on the other side? The right man on the other side was Mr. Nelson Mandela.
So you were ahead of the nationalist government in that?
If you're asking a political question, I think yes, we were. But intelligence services, as you know, Sue, should always be ahead of government. So, and we were certainly, let me put it this way, we were certainly taking the lead in convincing P.W. Botha and his government that the only way to find a lasting settlement would be to find a negotiated settlement with the ANC itself.
Now, Professor Willie Esterhazy, was this a sort of dream for you?
I've never imagined that. It came as a big surprise. I hail from the Karoo, and the Karoo is a semi-desert area, so nothing really happens in the Karoo. So when I got this sort of invitation, I really sort of thought, well, this is something.
You must have been chosen because they thought you either had a lot of charm or that you were somebody who might persuade people to do things.
Well, I decided never to ask them that question, but just jump into the water. And that's what I did.
Well, this is a perfect moment to bring in Thabo Mbeki in Johannesburg. Mr. Mbeki, when did you first consider that these talks might be a goer?
Well, you know, I think it was 1985 when the then President, P.W. Botha, delivered what was called the Rubicon speech. And one of the consequences of that was that we then began to get quite a lot of visits to meet with the ANC. I think the first group was a group of business people. And that sort of gave an indication to us that the population in the country, I'm talking now more about the white population in the country, that they wanted change.
Alistair Sparks, you studied this period and indeed were an important newspaper editor during it. Possibly the outside world didn't understand quite how demonized Nelson Mandela was among some sections of the white population at the time.
He was systematically demonized by the government, by the regime and its propaganda instruments, chief of which was the Broadcasting Corporation,
where we're sitting right now.
That's right, in the belly of the beast. There was a lot of agitation in the business community. The country was being subjected to sanctions. There was disinvestment. They had to try and come to some arrangement to release Nelson Mandela from prison. That had become the big issue. But Botha was terrified of seeming weak.
PW instructed us to start secret negotiations with Mandela, and I think he played a very crucial and constructive role. But the South African government took a decision consciously to negotiate themselves out of political power.
But meanwhile, out on the streets, Archbishop Tutu, there was a lot of anger.
Oh, absolutely. Increasingly so. We were becoming experts at conducting funerals where the authorities would lay down restrictions on the number of people who were allowed to be at a funeral. And each time
You knew that one struggle, funeral, was going to be the cause of many others. We also had the internecine violence within our community, which we believe largely was instigated and supported by your wonderful people.
You're looking at Dr. Barnard.
Yes, I mean, but also when the situation is volatile, it takes very little to set off a conflagration.
We have a cause that is just. Our cause is a just cause. And we cannot use methods which our enemy will use against us.
The rising spiral of violence in the cities only confirmed President Botha's conviction that the ANC was under the control of international communism.
Two organizations are now so interwoven that no one can enter into discussions with the ANC without the knowledge that he is probably also in discussion with the South African Communist Party.
We have to make apartheid unworkable and our country ungovernable.
In public, the ANC's message to the international media was uncompromising.
We couldn't accept anything short of majority rule.
The head of the ANC in exile in Zambia, Oliver Tambo, was holding out for nothing less than majority rule.
It's a just demand, isn't it, really? I mean, we are human beings. We can't place ourselves in the position of subhumans in our country.
In secret, in May 1988, President Botha arranged for a group of people to broaden discussions with the imprisoned Mandela. But the presence of members of the National Intelligence Service upset him.
Though I was prepared to talk to members of the government, I was not prepared to talk to a master spy.
Neil Barnard, you were the master spy who Mandela presumably was referring to there. He didn't initially want to talk to you.
We had the first meeting in the officer commanding at Polsmoor prison, and we immediately established a very good relationship. The fundamental issue at stake was to conduct the negotiations in secrecy. And I can assure you that if we started off in 88, negotiating through the CNN or through the London Times or through the New York Times or through the UN, we would have never been able to achieve a negotiated settlement. And a brief was, try to find out if there is common ground on three issues. What will the ANC be doing about violence? Secondly, what would the political model of the future, if you would like to be the constitution, look alike? And thirdly, there was the issue of the role of the South African Communist Party.
No, I think, as Neil was saying, we were all conscious on both sides that if any information of the talks got out, it would be sabotaged by elements in both camps.
And Thabo Mbeki, how was Nelson Mandela, from the ANC point of view, kept in the loop as a prisoner?
Well, he, as he had indicated in this that clip that you played, he was in contact with Oliver Tambo, because his relatives, his people, his wife, Winnie, for instance, would obviously visit. And on a number of occasions when she did that, she would take messages to him and she would bring messages back.
Can I ask you, after this period of time, perhaps you can reveal a little more, how did Winnie Mandela pass on messages and receive them? Were they on bits of paper?
When we were in Swaziland, both her daughters, Zinzi and Zanani, were at school there in Swaziland. So what would happen is that we would write notes, pack them in a box of chocolates or put them in a bottle of talcum powder or something, and they would take it across the border. The mother would then, of course, read that and then should be able to convey whatever the message to the husband, to Nelson.
Well, let me ask the master spy if he knew all about this, Dr. Barnard.
We certainly knew exactly the way of communication, exactly. And the answer to that one is very, very easy. Why should we try to isolate Mandela while we're trying to find a settlement? We should keep that lines of communication open all the time. P.W. Botha was asking me many times during these 2 years, sir, when am I going to inform the cabinet about this negotiations which is taking place? And I invariably gave him an answer which is not very popular with politicians, but I have to say it. I told him, sir, the moment
you inform Cabinet, there are at least one member who is genetically incapable of keeping information like that to himself. Can you imagine what would have happened? The amount of pressure to be brought about by international organizations, by the right wing in the Afrikaner establishment, by the whatever wings in whatever movements, it would have made it impossible for us to construct a footprint from which to work.
What would have happened, of course, is the hardliners, I think,
on both sides.
Yes, would certainly have put metaphorically put a bomb under the possibility of all of this. I mean, the people who said we are marching to Pretoria, and the African right wing. I mean, we saw what happened when the negotiations had begun. I mean, that they actually attacked the venue of the talks.
Willie Esterhuizen.
Yeah, just to sort of emphasize the seriousness of that situation, they tried to train me in security matters. And then at one stage I asked the person who sort of dealt with this issue, and I said, listen, but I'm sure the ANC will not kill me. They need me. So the guy looked at me in utter desperation and amazement. He said, but we're not protecting you against the ANC, it's against the brown shirts. It's the first time I heard the phrase brown shirts.
That means the far right wing.
That was the military. Or elements within the military. Elements also.
There was an incident that I think illustrates just how volatile this was. I was in the group that went to Dakar. There were 20-odd people. And of course, the word did get out that all these Afrikaners, these were people judged to be liberal, verlichte Afrikaners, had gone to make this personal contact with the ANC. That act was regarded as traitorous. It was almost treasonous. And on our return, when we landed at Johannesburg Airport, security officials came aboard the aircraft and said, please don't disembark yet. The right wing had turned out in force, and there was going to be a punch-up. And so they smuggled us out by another route, and we later met at a hotel, an airport hotel, with the spouses who'd arrived at the airport to meet us.
Let me say on the lighter side of things, I'm so glad that once in the history the security people really took care of Alistair Sparks. That has been really commendable, I must say.
They nearly took care of me in other ways on many occasions, I must say.
I think the point which Alistair is raising is absolutely crucial, Sue, and that is that this was no easy road to travel. Military intelligence circles, even within some people within the NIS, they were not all angels.
The government took a step to improve Mandela's conditions by moving him to a cottage in the grounds of Victor Verster prison near Paarl.
It was really not a prison.
His lawyer, George Bezos, again.
It was an office at which the leader of the ANC within the country was actually conducting business.
Mandela was taken on clandestine outings to the seaside and into the countryside.
If Mr. Mandela is prepared to reject violence, surely I'm prepared to talk to him. But he is not prepared to reject violence.
In February 1989, President P.W. Botha suffered a mild stroke and stood down as leader of the National Party. During his recuperation later that year, he finally agreed to a face-to-face meeting with Mandela, in secret, at his Cape Town presidential office, Tuinhuis.
Yes, I was tense because I was expecting a fight. As I entered, he came from the other door with his hand stretched out and smiling. If I had to judge a P.W. Botha from that meeting, I regard him as a first-class gentleman.
Neil Barnard, you had to make sure, and some of your colleagues, that Nelson Mandela would find the outside world comfortable eventually.
Yeah, mention has been made about former Minister Kobie Coetzee. He instructed us that we should prepare Mr. Mandela to be the next president of the country. Not in gumboots and an overall releasing him somewhere on the Cape Flats, but taking him to a house, prepare him for the day in which he will be released.
Willie Esterhuizen, we heard there P.W. Botha, then president, saying that until violence was renounced, he wouldn't consider releasing Nelson Mandela. Tell us something about the character of P.W. as he's known. He was quite a stubborn man and he had a temper, didn't he?
Oh, I think he was a stubborn man. But the one thing about him which I will say in public is that if you've talked the thing through with him and given him your honest position, he will accept that. He will disagree with you, but he will not be vindictive.
You met him several times, Archbishop. Is that how you saw him?
Well, I have a slightly different experience. I was already Archbishop and we met in his office. The first part, he was very friendly and treated me like he thought I was reasonably important as the Archbishop of Cape Town. And then there was a switch when he accused me of having been at a funeral where I walked in front of a communist flag. And we ended up like two small boys, finger wagging at each other. I mean, he pointed at me and I was pointing at him. And I said, I take exception to your treating me in this fashion. And he said, you can take your exception and go.
I would also disagree that he was not vindictive. I think he and his government were vindictive on many occasions and did great injury to a lot of people.
P.W. Botha, for all of the bad things that had happened, he had led the apartheid system, which was very brutal, very cruel, and all that. But the point is correct, that P.W. Botha did indeed authorize that people like Neil Barnard should begin this process of engagement. Because I think even for him, with his history in the National Party and his history in government and so on, he had come to understand that something had to give.
Then there was this extraordinary meeting between Mr. Mandela and President Botha. Neil Barnard, you were present at that very secret meeting. Tell us how it happened and what was it like?
We took him from Paulsmoor to Tuinhuis, and we took him into Tuinhuis past the security police. Talk to P.W. Botha.
Did you actually sort of look him over before he went in to visit the president?
I grew up in an Afrikaner house where one respects elder people. And we were sitting there and I looked down and Mr. Mandela was very neatly dressed, as he always preferred, and we knew that. We had a wonderful suit on and a tie and everything was wonderful. And I looked down and I saw his shoelaces was not tied. And I didn't kneel as it is described somewhere. I went down and tied his shoelaces. Because can you for one single moment think what it would have been for him when he had been falling down, entering PW's office in Tuinhuis?
I didn't realize you were so subtle, sir, that you could bend so far down without actually going on your knees. I suppose it would have been a bit humiliating to admit that you did. Anyway, it was I think, a remarkable gesture of the chief of the security police tying the prisoner's shoelaces. Somehow symbolic of a change of power that was in the offing.
May I, if you don't mind, return? We talked to Mr. Mandela, I myself, many hours before that meeting, telling him, please don't touch thorny political issues. Talk about your children and the grandchildren and the Anglo-Boer War and the future and everything else. But please just come together. It was a very good meeting. It lasted about an hour and 10 minutes. It was like, with a lot of respect, like two old men starting to talk about their health.
And Aziz Pahad, you had talks with Mr. Mbeki and others out of South Africa with the people representing the South African government.
No, I think, as Neil was saying, we were all conscious that if any information of the talks got out, it would be sabotaged by elements in both camps. And I think both sides had taken some precautions that if there was any leaks, it would be just misguided Afrikaners talking to ANC dissidents. And so that would have been the tactical approach.
What did you make of these Afrikaners when you first met them, I wonder? Because, I mean, you were trained in a sense to demonize them, weren't you?
Yeah, but we were conscious what was propaganda was not sometimes the reality. And I think the talks in the UK and in Switzerland were the first sort of talks where we got down to details about the future. And I think we all got to know each other much better. We got to understand each other's positions much better.
The first time I met Aziz, he spoke in Afrikaans to me. And he asked me about the country and the sun. And I must say the weather at that stage was horrible in Britain. So talking about the South African sun was something. It was not political. And I think...
Were you surprised he spoke in Afrikaans?
No. I did my homework. And I know where he comes from.
He got information from Neil.
I got information from Neil and his people. The point I want to make is, and I think this was the so-called Mel's talk.
Near Bath in
Near
Somerset.
Bath. And that's the first point, is that it was an informal, non-official. So it was not just secret and confidential, there was no official status to it. And that was extremely important.
So I think that...
Alistair?
I think one of the key things here was that it wasn't only Nelson Mandela who was demonized, but the whole ANC. These were characterized as communist, bloodthirsty communist terrorists. And what struck me then as a journalist was to see the scales fall from people's eyes.
Well, I believe it was a remarkable experience because we sat there for hours. We were speaking bad Afrikaans, they were speaking very bad English. But
Still do.
But we began to, in the informal sessions, we began to really exchange a lot of information and a lot of ideas. And in the end, I think we all emerged from there knowing more about the fears of the whites and the aspirations of the majority. And that helped us.
I think you should say that both sides discovered that the other was human.
Or South African.
Yeah, I mean that we are South Africans and we are human together.
Yeah, again, as Aziz was saying, we learned a lot about what was happening in the country and what was happening broadly among the Afrikaner population and so on, which helped us to understand the situation in the country better and therefore to respond to it more correctly.
It says something about the negotiating value of whiskey, Scotch whiskey, doesn't it?
It's a great facilitator, that is correct.
It's in vino veritas.
But somebody keeps telling the story that when I was falling asleep in one of the discussions, you kicked me under the table and said, "Don't fall asleep and leave me alone with these Boers." Now you are denying it.
The National Party say we don't deal with terrorism and we don't deal with perpetrators of violence.
In his public speeches, the newly elected F.W. de Klerk continued to condemn the ANC, but in private he'd learnt for the first time about the 3 years of secret negotiations. When I met him a few days before this gathering, he made it clear to me that the news had come to him as a complete shock.
The late Kobie Coetzee came to me and brought also Neil Barnard and others to brief me fully on what has been taking place behind the scenes.
What was your reaction? Were you angry? Were you surprised? Were you furious?
No, I wasn't angry. I was justified in my general criticism of P.W. Botha that he didn't run the country on the basis of real cabinet government. But it made sense to me. I was fully briefed on Mandela himself, and there was no doubt in my mind that the ANC represented a majority of black South Africans.
F.W. de Klerk gave permission for a major ANC protest march to take place in Cape Town, and a few months later de Klerk released 4 leading ANC prisoners, including Walter Sisulu. Alistair Sparks, just take us through the change of president. P.W. was ill. His party in the end asked him to step down.
I think it was a palace coup. You know, the stroke was obviously a mild one. He didn't want to go. There was quite a stormy cabinet meeting by all accounts. And then the president went on television that night when they had effectively told him he had to step down, and he delivered a very bitter national television speech. Incidentally, there was one seminal moment, I think, that involved Mr. Mbeki. We were in Ghana, which is very symbolic, you know, the home of Pan-Africanism, really, and some very militant students were there. And suddenly, several of them started having a go at Mr. Mbeki, saying, "Why are you talking to these oppressors? You should be killing them. You're letting Africa down." And Mr. Mbeki responded in a way that I believe was a seminal moment. And he set out explaining that the ANC was a non-racial organization. South Africa was going to be a non-racial country. And he delivered a very articulate, impressive address on that. And I think that that was a watershed moment for a lot of the white folk in that gathering.
Thabo Mbeki?
Well, as Alistair has explained, it was important for the continent to understand that though it supported our struggle very, very strongly, it really had to support that struggle on our terms rather than try to define what the struggle should be about.
But things moved very fast once de Klerk was president. And from your point of view, Thabo Mbeki, there was the February the 2nd speech, which you, of course, would have listened to with enormous interest and anticipation. February the 2nd, 1990. Where were you when you heard that speech?
I think we were in Sweden, I think. But in the discussions that took place with Neil Barnard and some of his colleagues, we had agreed about all of these things, about the release of political prisoners, the unbanning of the ANC and other organizations and so on. Those things had already been agreed. And indeed, Neil and his people did alert us that in the speech of February the 2nd, then these matters on which we had already agreed, they would then be announced.
But not the unbanning of the Communist Party.
No, that's one of the matters that was discussed quite vigorously, because there was a view where we were sure we must unban the ANC and the others, but not the Communist Party. But of course, I mean, we on our side insisted that no, everybody had to be unbanned.
Sue, I'm very sorry, but this is a very crucial point, and I must be allowed to make it. Let me, on the lighter side of things, just remind the former President Mbeki that during those negotiations, I one early morning, I think it was 4 a.m, ordered a bottle of Blue Label Johnny Walker whiskey, and I can tell you, former President, that the Auditor General is still looking after me, because a DG would never have been allowed to order a Johnny Walker Blue Label. So the absolute crucial point is that 2 days prior to the speech of de Klerk, there was a heated debate in top government circles whether the South African Communist Party should be banned or not. And I think it must be said that heated debate was won by the people who said, first of all, Mr. Mandela would possibly, if we put that precondition, say, well, then I prefer to stay in prison. And if he would have taken that line, everything we have been doing until that time would have just fallen flat. So there was a very deliberate decision, if we go it, let us go all the way and unban the South African Communist Party as well.
This is the middle of the checkpoint. The gates have been opened. The police are making no attempt.
The collapse of communism across Europe gave de Klerk an opening to act.
I am serious about bringing this matter to finality without delay.
On February the 2nd, 1990, de Klerk made his momentous speech.
That the government has taken a firm decision to release Mr. Mandela unconditionally.
The people on the streets believe today is their victory, not President de Klerk's. Partial victory, not complete, but victory after years of defiance.
The time for talking has arrived, and whoever still makes excuses does not really wish to talk.
Lots of whistling and cheering. The crowd is just catching a sight of this figure now. Yes, he's alongside Winnie Mandela, both of them raising their arms in the air. And now Mr. Mandela walks through the gate. He's a free man as of this moment.
I was quite frightened by the crowd. And the warders, and their families were just swamped by the crowd. And there was a great deal of chaos and confusion.
February the 2nd speech was extraordinary, and then the event the world was waiting for, February the 11th, 1990, Nelson Mandela was released. Archbishop Tutu, you were in the centre of Cape Town, I think, when that moment happened.
Yes, in fact, I was in Johannesburg an hour or so before, and we couldn't get flights back to Cape Town. Fortunately, the man who was my media secretary got us a lift on a plane. I mean, this is the first time that I thumbed a lift on a plane, and we arrived. It was one of the most worrying things. People had expected him to come at a particular time. Huge crowds on Grand Parade in front of the City Hall. And the pressure of the crowds was enormous. And then they said, I had colluded with the authorities, the regime. It was not true that Nelson Mandela was coming, and it was touch and go. Those people nearly lynched me. And they said, no, they were thinking that he shouldn't come. And I said, shoo, do you want this place to go up in flames? And I insisted that even if it was just for him to appear, because people do not believe he has been released and we are in serious trouble.
Aziz Bahad, where were you at this moment?
Well, we were all gathered in one of our secret talks in Mel's Park, and an hour before...
This was in England?
In England, and an hour before the speech of the release, the announcement, we were told that it was going to happen. And then we decided then to have a good, quick celebration. We left in our respective ways to get back to London. I went to Trafalgar Square and joined the demonstrations that were taking place at Trafalgar Square.
Villiers de Haze?
Yeah, I have to say that we sat in London and in a studio, and it was Aziz and Tabu and two of my sons, and it was, for me, it was quite an historical moment. I remember telling my two sons that, listen, the response by Thabo Mbeki will indicate whether we should stay in the country or not. I'm talking about my sons. And he was sucking his pipe, and when Mandela came out, and I can't mention it in the Oxford English of my friend, but he said, now there is hope for the country, now there will be peace. And then I said to my children, this country is our country and we will make it work.
Well, let me tell you, so Aziz didn't tell you, Neil also didn't. They had also, they alerted us, Neil, the NIS, about the release. And what had been agreed is that they were going to use certain code words to indicate when the release would happen. But of course, we're in England, so when the message got through, my wife picked up the phone and got the message and thought it was quite innocuous. And the arrangement was that she would then pass it on to Aziz's wife. She also thought it was innocuous. So she also delayed passing it on to Aziz. So we could have got the message much earlier. But with all of us forgotten about these code words that had been agreed. Neil and company had kept their word on this. But we clearly were not as used to being spooks as they are.
Neil Barnard, now hand on heart, tell us what honestly was your reaction when you saw on the television Nelson Mandela stepping out of prison?
Let me say that I've been asked by Mr. Mandela to be present when he left. Or I told him, sir, this is your moment of glory. Don't share it with a master spy, so to speak. And let me just say very briefly that he should have arrived, Archbishop, earlier, but because some of his guests arrived late, Winnie inter alia, with a lot of respect, there was a time delay, and that caused a hell of a lot of trouble for all of us.
Alistair Sparks?
It was quite unruly, and eventually it took place in fading light. And just as one little further quirk, Mandela had left his reading glasses in the prison, and he had to borrow Winnie's, which were not an exact fit, and struggle in the dark to read his speech, which should have been a great moving speech, but he actually battled to read it in the dark and with the wrong glasses. But it was obviously, I think the single most historic moment in all of our history.
But be that as it may, he was released, and to answer your question, yes, there would be few places in the world where a man with the stature of Mandela, after 27 years in prison, could be negotiated and released and take his rightful place as a leader of the world. I think that was the point.
Villiers de Haze, of course, nobody really knew what Mandela looked like except people who'd had face-to-face talks with him. When he stepped out of the prison gates and you were watching on television.
Oh, I'll give you a very honest answer. I'm a Calvinist, so I don't shed tears too easily. But I had tears in my eyes rolling down my cheeks. That's the first point.
Was that for South Africa, for yourself?
That was for South Africa. And the man was important. He had a sort of messiah status. I accepted him as the symbol of reconciliation for the country. So for me, it was in philosophical terms, it was the most historic but existential moment in my life.
Aziz?
But Willie, didn't you get a feeling that the years of discussions in the UK, the discussions in Switzerland had finally resulted in the release of Mandela? Because I believe without those discussions and talks, we would have never created the necessary confidence and framework for the release to take place. Yeah. And therefore it was a moment of success, I think, as well.
That release marked the end of one phase and the beginning of the next. That was its great significance, because indeed what then happened was that we then immediately began the preparations for the formal negotiations. That was the last obstacle. His imprisonment was the last obstacle in terms of beginning those negotiations. So his release, I'm saying, marked the end of one phase and the beginning of the next, which actually was more difficult.
Last word to you, Archbishop Tutu.
He came and spent his first night of freedom in Bishop's Court, which is the Archbishop's official residence. And he had an aura. He has an aura. And God has given us an incredible gift in him. We wouldn't have got where we have had it not been that at that precise moment in the history of our country, we had this person who had this moral authority to say, let us walk the path of reconciliation and not retribution. And here we are, celebrating and giving thanks for a fantastic gift to our nation, which has become a sign of hope to the rest of the world, that if something that was thought to be so intractable could be resolved in the way it was, then no way in the world can they ever say again we have an intractable problem.
Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Dr. Neil Barnard, Professor Willie Esterhazy, Alistair Sparks, Aziz Bahad, and former President Thabo Mbeki. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.